This time on Eye on Yellow Fever, we go in depth into the vital work around the world of preventative vaccination campaigns for yellow fever and a range of outbreak diseases.
We've had incredible success with vaccines over the past 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, but we've hit a plateau and we need to get beyond that plateau.
The Eye Strategy's key goal is to put an end to yellow fever epidemics by 2026. Alongside this, there is also a broader set of global health vaccination goals called Immunization Agenda 2030.
The Immunization Agenda 2030 is the world's plan for every partner, every country, for achieving some pretty ambitious goals around immunization and the impact that immunization will have in the 20s. There's still deaths that occur from vaccine preventable diseases, and those are, by definition, completely preventable deaths. What are the things that need to happen in order to achieve those new ambitious goals?
The risk of outbreaks of the deadly disease yellow fever is both significant and growing. This is down to a cocktail of contributing factors, including climate change and increasing pressure on land, greater movement of people, particularly into cities, and a resurgence in our highly connected world of the mosquito species that carries and transmits the disease. Yellow fever may not be the most obvious global public health threat, but it's a disease with no cure and a growing risk that must be taken seriously. We are Eliminate Yellow Fever Epidemics, that's I for short. From the world's most senior public health experts to those on the front line of combating this deadly disease wherever it emerges, we have the inside story on yellow fever's expanding global risk. This is Eye on Yellow Fever.
Hello, I'm Maggie Silver, and it's great to be back with you. In this episode, I'm pleased to say we're taking time for an in-depth chat about immunization with one of the World Health Organization's leading figures on public health strategies.
My name is Kate OBrien. I'm the director of the Department of Immunizations, Vaccines, and Biologicals at the World Health Organization in Geneva. So what the Immunization Agenda 2030 does, the goals of the agenda are about preventing deaths, and they're also about achieving the elimination or even the eradication of particular diseases.
So that leads perfectly into the next question. How does this agenda apply in practice? In other words, what is the day-to-day work of the teams around the world that are driving towards the goals that are laid out in this agenda?
We have some strategic priorities. It's about achieving coverage of vaccines and equity in the coverage of vaccines. That's one of the strategic priorities. Another strategic priority is having adequate supply and sustainability of the supply. Another priority is on research and innovation. And another one I'll mention is on commitment and demand. So for each of these strategic priorities, there is day-to-day work that we're doing to actually move the needle on whether those things are happening. And so I'll just give you maybe the clearest example is on vaccine coverage. The first is, how do you even know how many children, adolescents, and adults have received vaccines? So there are data collection steps, there are data collection efforts that every country has to say how many vaccines they've actually deployed and delivered. But what we want those data collection efforts to be better. They're not necessarily fully accurate. We also perhaps don't get that data in a way that you can look at the data to say, well, where are the gaps? Do we know whether they're in particular parts of a given country or in particular religious groups or in particular ethnic groups? And the reason we need better data is because actions actually come from those data. If you can see in the data that you're missing a big chunk of people in one particular part of the country, then there are specific actions that would take place. Oh gosh, we need to send some immunization teams out to that part of the country. So those are some examples of the kinds of activities that sort of emerge from having a big strategy.
And I imagine for each of those areas and priorities, there are different challenges that we face for them. Can you go over some of the challenges that the on-the-ground teams face to address whether it's vaccine equity, supply, or commitment and demand?
Yeah, so on the equity side, which is really the overarching part of this strategy, the kinds of things that we're really facing is that we need to know who the people are, especially who the children are, who are getting no doses of vaccine through the routine immunization program. And it's hard to know something that is absent. So you don't know what you don't know. If they're, by definition, if they're getting 0 doses, presumably we don't know who they are. We don't know where they are. Otherwise, we would have already had some outreach to identify and to encourage them to get those services. These kids they're not random. They tend to live in urban slum areas. They may be religious minorities. These are very poor communities of people. These 0-dose children are also found in remote rural settings. They may be moving from place to place. They don't actually have a house, a place of residence where they're stationary. And then the third category are those kids and families who are living in conflict settings or humanitarian emergencies. Again, very vulnerable populations, very vulnerable communities who are very displaced from any of the services that they usually have. And they may be living in conflict settings. So there may be great danger to actually trying to deploy vaccine services to those families. So those are sort of the 3 general big categories of who are children who end up getting no vaccines, 0 vaccines through the routine immunization program.
I imagine another component to lower vaccine coverage is also public trust in vaccines. Can you talk a little bit about how we go about increasing public trust in vaccines to help increase those rates of vaccinated individuals?
Yeah, there's no vaccine program unless people want the program, unless people have confidence that this is going to benefit themselves or benefit their loved one, usually a child. So vaccine confidence is a really important attribute of any program anywhere around the world. What's also important is that people they value their time and their effort to go get a vaccine. In other words, you're not going to spend time going to get a vaccine if you don't believe that there's something important to be prevented. So part of the issue around demand and confidence in vaccine programs is even having knowledge of what are the diseases, what are the illnesses against which we actually vaccinate people that we're preventing. And we know that presently, in the current situation, COVID vaccine aside, the vaccines that are being used around the world at the levels of coverage we have are preventing around 4 million to 4.5 million deaths every single year. So these are incredibly powerful public health tools that we have. What we are facing, though, is a lot of misinformation. And we have very clear examples where when people are provided with incorrect information, false information, some of it, unfortunately, is deliberately being deployed. Some of it is just misinformed people, but some of it is very deliberate misinformation whose intent is to undermine the confidence that people have in what are important public health programs. We know that when those kinds of information are disseminated and are being, circulated, especially on social media, people die as a result. We've seen that in COVID. We've seen it in measles, that when people are not vaccinated against what are life-threatening diseases, and the reason that they're not vaccinated is because they were the subject of misinformation, incorrect information. This leads to outbreaks of disease and people lose their lives. So this is a very serious business. And that's why we're in this very difficult place right now, where the confidence that people have in vaccines is being undermined by misinformation.
Can you give us an example of where we've been successful in overcoming these barriers, whether it's to reach these 0 vaccine individuals or overcome this misinformation that you've been talking about in countries like South Sudan or Guinea, where, there's difficulty with resources, with the populations that you were describing earlier? How do we really implement what's in this agenda? And are there examples that we can tap into for how to get this done?
I love your question because, yes, there's some very concrete examples and really tangible ways in which this is going to work. So the first is on stronger partnerships and coordination. I'll give the example in polio, where people who were doing immunization and actually going house to house to try to identify children who had missed their vaccines, we were just talking about the zero-dose children, were male public health workers. And that just didn't work because of the culture in the country. When it was sort of realized how many of the workers were male, and some switching was done to hire female workers who could go house to house in an appropriate, cultural context, it was much easier to gain access into homes and to speak with the mums of the kids who were there. So that's like a really concrete example of sort of really being very specific about the country context.
We'll hear more from Dr. Kate OBrien in the second half of this episode, where we'll focus more fully on yellow fever.
The I strategy is about having the evidence and having data to direct where vaccines are most needed, especially for anticipating outbreaks, while at the same time getting the routine immunization with yellow fever vaccines deployed.
This is episode 6 of a 10-part series from our I team and partnership. To learn more about us and our objectives, see the link in the show notes for this episode in your podcast player, or just search online for Eliminate Yellow Fever Epidemics. And while you're researching online, there are plenty of other resources available to you too. This, for example, is one I'd recommend. This is the very powerful opening of an I strategy documentary film shot in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. You see a man walking the streets with a megaphone explaining the dangers of yellow fever and calling on people to get the vaccinations being offered to them.
La fièvre jaune, c'est une maladie virale causée par un virus amaril. C'est une maladie qui est endémique, surtout en Afrique et en Amérique latine.
In the film, Dr. Blaise Barthindoli and others recount the work that goes into a preventative mass vaccination campaign. It's beautifully shot, it's subtitled for non-French speakers, and it's well worth checking out. We've included a link to the film in the show notes for this episode. And as for us, as with all podcasts, if you want to get episodes of Eye on Yellow Fever automatically downloaded to your phone or device, just click subscribe or follow. Now on to the rest of our conversation with Dr. Kate OBrien. So, Dr. OBrien, how does the Immunization Agenda 2030 strategy specifically relate to yellow fever vaccination, and how does that work with our I strategy to eliminate yellow fever epidemics?
So, if we look at this from the perspective of yellow fever and trying to make sure that the yellow fever epidemics are something of the past and not continue to be epidemics of the future, the strategy for yellow fever is well lined up with the strategy for Immunization Agenda 2030. And I'll give you some examples of that. So in the yellow fever strategy, one of the priorities is to control outbreaks as rapidly as possible. So that's around data and surveillance, which is a component of the Immunization Agenda. It's around having emergency vaccines for rapid deployment. You can only do that if you have adequate supply and a sustainable supply. And those are strategic priorities in the Immunization Agenda. Another strategic objective of the I strategy is protecting at-risk populations. Instead of waiting for an epidemic to happen or an outbreak to happen, getting in before that outbreak might happen and immunizing people in a preventive way. Well, the only way to do that is actually to be working through that routine immunization program, which is, the full-on scale of what IA 2030 has as some of its priorities. And then there's another strategic objective, which is to prevent the international spread of yellow fever. So that really means about this urban readiness, making sure that especially in the urban slum areas where rapid scaling of an epidemic could happen, that they're protected and that at-risk workers are protected, anticipating that an outbreak might happen, making sure that health workers especially are protected. So those are some of the ways in which the I strategy is actually completely interdigitated with the strategic priorities of IA 2030. There's also something important about IA 2030 that links directly to the I strategy. We have these principles around any vaccine program should be people-centered, should be totally owned by the country, should be grounded in partnerships, and should be guided by data. And the I strategy is about partnerships. The I strategy is about having the evidence and having data to direct where vaccines are most needed, especially for anticipating outbreaks, while at the same time getting the routine immunization with yellow fever vaccines deployed. So those are just some of the ways in which there's a complete synergy between the I strategy and Immunization Agenda 2030. Yellow fever also has to do with non-human primates and mosquito vectors. And so those One Health principles, which is beyond the human component, is beyond what IA 2030 does. So that vector control, the vector surveillance, and the management of people who do get ill, the I strategy and yellow fever strategy also includes for those who have developed yellow fever to assure that the best treatments are recommended and are able to be deployed.
Continuing with a focus on yellow fever, we've had a yellow fever vaccine for decades now, but we still have issues with vaccine coverage for yellow fever. And are there ones specific to yellow fever that we should be thinking about?
Part of the problem is which are the companies that are interested in actually producing yellow fever vaccine. Yellow fever vaccine is not a global vaccine. It's not like every country in the world is using yellow fever vaccine. It's really constrained to those countries that have a yellow fever problem in the country. And it's for travelers who are traveling to or coming from a yellow fever area. So part of the issue is that the sort of mix of the countries, first of all, it's not a global demand. And secondly, the mix of the countries have not always been clear about the number of doses, the intent of the doses that they need. So is it really just about stockpiling vaccine to respond to outbreaks of disease? Or is there a strong demand for the doses that are needed to immunize all infants? So that's the interplay between manufacturers who need a strong signal from countries about how many doses they will demand, and then in turn, manufacturers having confidence that those doses will actually be purchased and will be deployed. So those are some of the problems that have happened with yellow fever, is that interplay between demand and supply.
Yeah, it's certainly in public health a unique supply-demand issue in terms of the market. Can you talk a little bit, Dr. OBrien, about what measures are being taken to make sure there's always yellow fever vaccine in the future? So are we working with vaccine manufacturers? What are we doing to make more robust childhood vaccination campaigns so there is that consistent supply need for the vaccines?
Yeah, so certainly the work with manufacturers is a critical component of this. Having that direct conversation with manufacturers about what the commitment is from countries for their program, that clear signal from countries that they will not just deploy today and tomorrow and this year, but the intent to continue the program for an indefinite future. So that's one issue. And then the second issue is having the funding in place, especially to procure those vaccines. And so that funding, there's a contribution of Gavi, the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization, which is an alliance of all of the partners around immunization. Gavi uses some of the money that it has to secure the purchase of yellow fever vaccines, which gives manufacturers the confidence that there will, in fact, be a paying market to actually take up the vaccines that they're producing.
So, Dr. OBrien, I know in order to implement an emergency vaccination campaign, we need to know when cases are actually happening. And one of the issues that the I strategy hopes to address is diagnostics. Can you talk a little bit about, how that plays into this?
Yeah, for every vaccine preventable disease, especially the ones that have outbreak potential, like yellow fever does, but also for ones like measles and meningitis, a bacterial pathogen that has outbreak potential, one of the most critical things is getting a quick diagnosis so that a rapid response can happen. For outbreaks, we want to make sure that they're identified as early as possible when they're in a small phase and they haven't already gotten to be some enormous outbreak where you're just overwhelmed with the size of the outbreak and it keeps scaling. And so one of the really important advances that's happened with yellow fever is the investment in rapid diagnostics and improving the lab capacity for making the diagnosis of yellow fever itself within countries. There has been an investment through the Gavi Alliance to advance the diagnostics for yellow fever in a large number of countries. And this has had an incredible impact in just a short number of years of reducing how much time it takes between identification of a potential outbreak because of people falling ill and getting that lab confirmation of, is this actually yellow fever? And the reason that is just so critical is it means that once we know it's yellow fever, the deployment of vaccines to encircle this outbreak and shut it down as quickly as possible is really critical for reducing the size of outbreaks. And eventually, of course, what we're aiming for through all of this is high population immunity through vaccination that prevents the outbreaks altogether.
Kind of stepping back a little bit. So the world reached a huge milestone this year when over 1 billion doses of the COVID-19 vaccine were administered. And that was just 4 months after the first vaccine was approved by the World Health Organization. Are there any lessons that we can take away from the speed of this program that can be applied to yellow fever?
I think there's so many lessons from the COVID vaccine experience so far. There are now over 6.3 billion doses of COVID vaccine that have been administered to people into their arms, which is absolutely extraordinary. I think some of the things that we can learn from this is that where there is political will and where there is a compelling explanation of the need for vaccines, there is funding available for those vaccines. That's the first thing. The second is that manufacturers of vaccines are really the most critical link in all of this, that there's nothing to deploy unless we actually have quality manufactured vaccines with supply security. And then I think the third thing that we've learned is that individual demand for vaccines is also a critical component of a successful vaccine deployment. That when people really understand what they're being protected against and why it's important, that there is very high demand for vaccines. And that results in governments responding to what their people want. And so I think it really is, probably these four elements that has really shown us that there is so much that is possible if there is that political leadership in a country to put an all-of-government approach behind the protection of people's health and their well-being. But I think the other thing that I really want to sort of focus on here is about the quality of the services. You and I know in any human behavior, in any of our day-to-day life, if you go off to get something that you want, that you're interested in getting, and you have an unpleasant experience with it, or if you go to the store, for instance, and you're aiming to buy something that you need for your home, and the store is out of it, right? And you go a week later and they're out of it again, you lose confidence in the ability of that service to actually give you what you need. So one of the most important things about getting increases in vaccine coverage is giving high quality services where people want to come back. They feel like they were respected when they went. They felt like they got what they needed. It's provided in a time and a place and an environment where they feel good about going, that it's offered in a way that suits their needs, that it's not so inconvenient, that there are countless barriers to actually trying to do the right thing. Everything that we can do to make it as simple, to basically bring vaccines to people, not having people have to come to the vaccines. There's nothing unique or special to low-income countries on this. Mothers, fathers, families, they want exactly the same things that any of us want, which is convenient, high-quality services that provide those things that they know are going to benefit their kids, themselves, for protection of their health.
Yeah, I love looking at it as, we're trying to serve you and how can we be better at our customer service. So I think that leads kind of nicely. You mentioned, whether they're from a wealthy country or a low income country, it doesn't matter. They deserve and need the same access to great healthcare. And so I'd like to talk just a little bit before we finish up about vaccine equity. So Dr. O'Brien, can you talk about what needs to happen to make immunization equitable and fair around the world, whether for yellow fever or other vaccines, say for measles or something else?
Well, immunization programs need to be firmly embedded in the country government annual budget. Immunization programs should not have to be negotiating with the Ministry of Health for the money that they need to serve people. This should be a line item in the country budget that is a kind of a no-touch line item. We see the power of vaccines. They are one of the most impactful public health interventions from a return on investment perspective. We know that for every dollar spent on vaccines, especially in low-income countries, low-middle-income countries, there's about a $44 return on investment. And this is measured by increased educational attainment, better health, growth, and lifespan of children who don't, as a result of their vaccines, don't suffer multiple hospitalizations or multiple illnesses that take them out of school. There are many ways in which vaccines are a best buy in public health. What we really need from an equity perspective is to recognize the importance of that government leadership financial commitment to programs. The second thing is the improvements don't necessarily have to all happen in all the places in all the same ways. We absolutely have to be working in a tailored approach, country by country, recognizing the specific issues in each country and putting most of our resources into those limited number of places where things are still quite far behind. That's what equity is. Equity isn't about equality. Equity is about putting increased resources in a limited number of places where more help is needed. You know, when we started out the podcast, I was talking about the data as one of the critical elements. And I just want to come back to that. You can't fix what you can't measure. And so the fundamental underpinning and driver of all of the achievement of equity is about kind of navigating where you are and where you need to get to. And that's driven by having really good data that can tell you where your interventions are going to be most impactful.
Well, Dr. O'Brien, thank you so much for joining me today. It was really great hearing more from you about yellow fever, the immunization agenda, and the I strategy. Thanks again for being with us.
Listen, I had a great time talking with you today, Maggie, and I hope folks who are listening to the podcast enjoy learning more about yellow fever.
Such a fascinating chat with Dr. Kate OBrien. Check in the show notes on your podcast app to find links to the work of the I strategy, the Immunization Agenda 2030, and also that fantastic YouTube documentary about the DRC vaccination program that I flagged earlier on. Word of mouth is so important when it comes to reaching new audiences with podcasts. So please, if you can, think of someone you know who'd be interested in the Eye on Yellow Fever podcast and send the link to them. You can also select subscribe or follow to make sure that all future episodes of Eye on Yellow Fever are automatically downloaded direct to your device. This episode was produced by Dave Howard with research from Amelia Jansen and sound design by Adam Whaley. I'm Maggie Silver. Eye on Yellow Fever is a Bango media production for Eliminate Yellow Fever Epidemics.